Welcome back, y'all, and in this lesson we are going to get this API hooked up. This is going to be a really exciting lesson, and we're going to start to see how to actually communicate with these things. So let's go ahead and get started by jumping into our assistant editor here, and let's go ahead and just make some connections just to make our life easier here as we develop this application. Let's go ahead and hook a few things up. Let's go ahead and create an IB action for the next quote button. So we're going to say on next quote button tap, and let's go ahead and add a few IB outlets. Let's go ahead and add the quote label. Let's go ahead and add the author image view and the author label. Whoops, I don't think I clicked the right thing there. Yeah, there we go. The author label. And let's go ahead and add the background image view. And that should be enough to get us started here. So with all of that, let's go ahead and add a function here. And we're going to call this function getQuote. And in this function, we're going to want to get a random quote from the API. But since we're going to be getting that random quote from the API, we need to be able to set that quote on the view controller class. So let's create a property up here, and we're going to call it quote, and it's going to be of type optional quote. So when we first load into this view controller, it's obviously going to be nil, and then after we make the API request, we're going to set that value. So to do that, we're going to create one last function that we're going to use, and we're going to call display quote. So what this is going to do is after the quote has been loaded via the API, we need to display it on screen. Cool. Now that we have that all set up, that should be enough to get us going. So let's go ahead and close out of the storyboard here, and we'll just open up the regular view controller. Now, to be able to do this, we're going to need to open up that API documentation one more time. So let's go ahead and open up Safari. Let's go to motivateme.kojo.io. And let's go ahead and look at this Swift example here. This is some great boilerplate code to actually get us started in making this API request. So go ahead and copy this code right here. And we'll go ahead and drop it in the getQuote method. So let's go ahead and talk a little bit about what is going on here. So first, we need to optionally unwrap this URL property. So whenever we create an instance of the URL, it's possible that the URL is actually not valid. So it's actually optional. So whenever you initialize a URL, it's possible that if you give it some incorrectly formatted URL string, that it might fail. It might be optional. So we need to go ahead and unwrap that. So let's go ahead and do that check right there. Then after that, we need to create one of these URL session data tasks. And a data task is just basically an API request. It could be other things as well, but in this particular case, we're going to be doing an API request. So now that we have this code here, there's going to be this completion handler closure here. And once the API has returned something to this data task, we're going to get that inside of this data property right here. So that's why we're going to do this guard let data equal data, just to make sure that this is actually there and that the data object is not nil. So now that we have the data back, oh, and by the way, we've got this task.resume function being called right here, and that's just to actually execute the request right away. So once we get the data back from the API request, what we need to do is we need to decode the JSON data. And the way that we're going to do that is we're going to create an instance of this thing called a Json decoder. So we're going to say let JSON decoder equal JSON decoder, and we're going to go ahead and initialize that. Now what we're going to want to do is we're going to want to say self.quote equals JSON decoder dot decode, and it's going to ask us for a type. So it's saying, what does this data object actually look like? And we already did all of this work in the previous video when we created the model. So the type that we're going to get back is actually quote response. and we need to put quote response dot self. Dot self is just saying this is what it's actually going to look like. And then we're going to say from the data that we got back from the API. So what is it saying now? Cannot assign value of type quote response to type quote. Of course, because our quote property here is of type quote, but what we're decoding is of type quote response. So now that we have this quote response object, what we can do is we can say dot data. Because if we remember, if we go into the quote response model, this has a dot data property. So inside the view controller, we can say, hey, decode this quote response. And then once we have that, we're going to do dot data, and that's how we're going to set our self.quote. Now we're getting one more little error here, and it's saying call can throw, but it is not marked with a try, and the error is not handled. So basically what this is saying is it's possible that when we're trying to decode this quote response, it could fail. So there's really two ways to handle these types of things. We could do what's called a try catch block, and we can say, hey, try to do this thing, and if it fails, do this other thing. Or we can just do this. We could say try with a question mark. And basically what this is saying is try to do this thing, and if for some reason it doesn't work, like for example, the data doesn't match the model that you gave me, then just make it nil. So we're just going to say default to nil if there is some type of error when you're trying to decode this thing. So this is just a very simple and graceful way in Swift of dealing with an error, a potential error. In this case, though, we know what the data object looks like, so we're not really all that worried about whether or not this is going to work. We can feel pretty confident that we're going to get back what we need to get back. So self.quote equals try that. Okay, cool. Now that we have that, what we're going to do is we're going to call the display quote method. Let's go ahead and click to the, oh, look, it says we need to put self.displayQuote. And that's because we're inside of a closure right now. Anytime you're inside of a closure, you have to do self. You can't just put display quote. We actually need to add the self property. So we're going to say self.displayQuote. Now let's go ahead and click next to the line 40 right here, and we're going to set a breakpoint, and we're going to take a look at what our data looks like once that comes back. But to make sure that we're getting a quote when the application first loads, let's go inside the viewDidLoad method, and let's say get quote. That way, as soon as the view loads, it's going to make a request to this URL. It's going to set the quote property, and then we're going to set a breakpoint to make sure that our data is getting set properly. So let's go ahead and run this application. Okay, and as soon as the application loads, we're going to see the view pop up, and then it should go back to Xcode, and we should get our breakpoint here. Now that we have our breakpoint, we can take a look at what our data inside of the view controller looks like. So let's go ahead and click on this self property here. Let's click on quote, and we can see that we successfully got a quote back from the API. So we can see the text says, if you're not willing to risk the usual, you'll have to settle for the ordinary. The author is Jim Ron. And then we've got the author image URL and the background image URL. So we are now successfully getting data back from the API. So before we actually close out this video, let's go ahead and set a little bit of data so that we can see it pop up here on screen. So to do that, let's go ahead and say the quote label dot text equals quote dot text, and then we're going to say author label dot text equals quote dot author. And if we run that, we're going to see that we get a, oh, looks like it's not calling. Okay. So it says this must be called from the main thread only. So I actually want to show you this error. So this is an error that I just made. I don't want to cut this out of the video because I want you to see that I make errors too. This happens. So basically what's happening here is when we call the URL session.shared.data task function, what it's intelligently doing in the background is calling that on another thread. So a phone has multiple threads or cores on the processor, and whenever we call a API endpoint, it's intelligently putting that task off on another thread. But we're actually not able to manipulate the UI on that thread. There's only one thread that we can manipulate the UI on, and that's the main thread. So whenever this closure gets called, and once we're handling all of this code right here, that is not happening on the main thread. This is happening on that other background thread that was called to execute the API request. So what we need to do is to send this code back to the main thread, we can call dispatch queue queue.main.async. And then we're going to put our code that we want to run on the main thread in here. And if we rerun this application, we should not have any problems now. And we can see that it looks like it's working properly. We've got a quote that says success is walking from failure to fail. And actually, I know I keep saying we're going to close out this video, but just so we can see the whole quote real quick, let's open up that storyboard. Let's click that quote text label. And as we've seen before, what we need to do is make the lines 0 so that it can expand down to multiple lines to cover all of the text. And if we run that, we're going to see the full quote along with the author right here. Obviously, we have a little bit more layout work to do, but this lesson's gotten pretty long. So let's go ahead and pick up in the next lesson where we will set the author image URL, the background image URL, and start to complete the UI a little bit. See you there.